Hello, this is Mr. Stansbury. I'm going to take you through some of the problems on the 9D Part 1 assignment. Okay, we'll start here with number 1. Find the amplitude of this thing here. Remember this here from our y equals a sine or cosine bx plus c. This deals with the amplitude. And really, it's the absolute value of a. So the amplitude of this is 4. If it happened to be y equals negative 4 sine x, the amplitude would still equal 4 because it's always absolute value of what we have out front here. Okay? Period is, this part here deals with, if you take 360 divided by this b, that gives us what the period is. So in this case here, we're going to take 360, divide it by 3, and that gives us that the period is 120 degrees. Okay? Principal axis is always going to be whatever the C is out here. Principal axis. Okay, so there it is, -3. So we don't want to write just -3 as the principal axis because the principal axis is a line. So you want to give the equation a line. It's y equals a -3 would be the principal axis. Okay? Okay. Find b given the function y equals sine bx, where b is greater than or equal to 0, has a period of 90. Okay, so if you know what the period is and you want to figure out what that letter is, b, you simply take 360, put it on top, divided by whatever the actual period is, and that's 90, and that gives us 4. So 4 is going to be what b is. So 4 equals b. Okay? State the maximum and minimum value of this here. So really when you're doing this, you have to take two things into account. You have to figure out what the principal axis is, plus 0. So there's our principal axis. Okay, and then you have to take into account what the amplitude is, right? So basically we're starting here at 0, and then the amplitude tells it to go up 4, so add 4 to get up to positive 4. And then we also subtract 4 to get down to -4. So there's our max, and there's our minimum. So max equals 4, minimum equals -4. Let's say if instead of plus 0, this was plus 1. This would start at 1. 1 plus 4 is 5 would be the maximum, and 1 minus 4 would give us -3, which would be the minimum. Okay? Okay. 6. State the transformation which maps y equals sine x onto y equals sine x minus 1. So really all that means is this whole graph is going to go down 1. So you're just going to translate down 1 unit. Okay? All right. And then 7, sketch the graph of the following for 0 to 720. Okay, so we're going to sketch this thing here. I always like to start with the principal axis, which is at 3. So if we're going to sketch, let's put this 3 here. And that's going to be our middle, our principal axis. And then our amplitude is whatever number's in front of the sign here. Since there's nothing there, you have to assume that it is 1. So we go up 1 to get to 4 is the maximum. Then we subtract 1 to get down to 2, which is the minimum. Right, so we got max and the minimum, and then we're going to sketch that thing for 720 degrees. So let's do, say, actually that's 432. Let's do this. Draw ourselves a little axes here. Ran out of room down here, so I'm just going to say that this is 360, 720. Cut each of those in half, 180, 540, and then cut each of those in half just to kind of give us some good scale here. So the period is the only thing we have left to do, right? Because we figured out the principal axis, maximum, minimum. Now we just got to figure out what the period is, and then we can plot our point. So the period's going to equal 360 always goes on top, and then we divide by whatever's right in front of x. Nothing there, so it's a 1. So our period is 360 degrees. So it's going to repeat every 360 degrees. Right? So since it is sine, we know that regular old sine graph looks like this, right? It goes up to 1, down to -1, and it repeats every 360 degrees. So it's not a negative, it's positive, so it starts here at 0. And then we know it's going to repeat every 360 degrees, so I'm going to put a dot every 360 degrees back there at 0. Okay? And then I know that, so we've got all the beginnings and the ends. I know that halfway in between all those, it's going to be at 0 as what again. So between those 2 points, we're going to put zeros in there. And then halfway between the first set of zeros, it's going to be at the top. It's going to be at the maximum. So that's at this point right here. It's going to max out. And then halfway between the next 2 zeros, it's going to be down at the bottom. And then it's going to repeat. So it's going to be halfway between is at the top, halfway between is at the bottom. Now we've got all our points. Now we just connect them with a nice little curvy line here. Try not to make a zigzag. It should be curved like so. I didn't really do a great job of this first one here. It should be more kind of like that, but you get the idea. Okay, so that there is number 1. Let's take a look at 9. Sketch the graph of the following for 0 to 720. Now we got y equals cosine x equals -1. So principal axis is right here at -1. So I'm going to do -1, and there's our principal axis. The amplitude, there's nothing in front of the cosine, so the amplitude is 1. So I'm going to add 1 to get up to 0 and subtract 1 to get down to -2. So -2 is the minimum. 0 is the maximum. I'm actually going to put a solid line there because that's where we want to have our x-axes, right? So we're going up to 720. So half of that's 360. Half of that is 540. Halfway between those, 180. And then maybe some other lines in here just to give us something to look at here. Okay, so we've got max, principal axis, minimum. The only other thing we really need to figure out is the period. And we also figure out if it's positive or negative. But let's figure out the period first. So the period's going to be, always do 360 on the top, divide by whatever's in front of x. There's no number in front, so that's a 1. So our period is 360 degrees. Okay. Plain regular old y equals cosine x looks like this. Starts at the top, goes down, comes back up. This is at 1. This is at -1, and this is 360 degrees, right? So this one here is a positive cosine, so it's going to follow this exact same pattern here. If it was negative, that means it would start at the bottom instead of starting at the top. Negative would look like this, but it's not that, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay, so cosine we know starts at the top, so my first point here is going to be up at the top, and my period is 360 degrees, so I'm going to repeat that point back up at the top here every 360 degrees. Okay, so we've done these 2 points. Now I know halfway between these 2 points it's at the minimum, so halfway between these 2 is at 180 is at the minimum. Halfway between those 2, 540, that's also at the minimum. Okay, and I know between the maximums and the minimums, they're always going to cut, both of them are always going to cut through at 0. So I know that halfway between those 2 is 0, halfway between these 2 is 0, 0, 0. I'm making all my dots. Always make all your dots and then connect them at the end. Don't try to take a shortcut, say, oh, I know what it looks like. I can just kind of sketch it. It's like people will always mess it up that way if you don't go through and sketch all your dots in there to help you make your nice little pretty graph. Okay, so there's number 9. Look at that, same. Oh, it's just part D. So that previous one was 9, I think A or whatever. Now we've got 9D. So we got y equals -1/3 cosine x. We're going to sketch this one here. So there's no number out there, so I'm going to put +0. There's no number in front of the x, so that's 1. Right, so that's going to help us figure out all of our stuff. Our principal axis is going to be right here at 0. Instead of making a dotted line, I'm just going to put a solid line because that's going to be our axes, right? And then 360, 540, 180, and then maybe some tick marks in between here. The amplitude is 1/3. So I know I have to go up 1/3 from here. So I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to call that 1/3. And then I also have to go down 1/3 from 0. So I'm going to call that negative 1/3. And then put my little dotted lines in there. That's my maximum. This is my minimum. And there's our principal axis, right? Now, last thing we have to do is figure out, well, not really the last thing. We got to figure out the period next. So 360 always goes on top, divided by whatever's in front of the x. That's over 1. So our period is 360 degrees. Okay, so I know it repeats every 360 degrees. And then we have that our cosine is negative 1/3. So if you remember again, y equals cosine x looks like this. So if it's y equals negative cosine x, that means it's going to flip over. It's going to start at the bottom, go up to the top, and then come back down to the bottom. Okay, so I now know that this here, since it's negative 1/3, actually is going to start at the bottom. And it's going to repeat every 360 degrees. So I know it's back at the bottom every 360. I know that we just did these points here, this and this. I know that halfway between, it's at the top. So halfway between those 2 points, it's at the maximum. Halfway between those 2 points, it's at the maximum. And I know that halfway between the maximums and minimums on both sides, it's going to be at 0. So halfway between these is 0. Halfway between those is 0. 0 and 0. And now we have all of our points so that we can sketch our graph. Again, the big thing I'm looking for, not zigzags in there, is that you're showing that it's curved, that it's not a straight. These are not going to be straight lines. Okay, one more to look at. Number 11, for what value of d does the graph y equals 3 cosine x plus d lie entirely above the x-axis? Okay, so here's the thing. Here's our amplitude, right? Amplitude is 3. So for it to be entirely above the x-axis, this d here, so like, you know, let's say if this d is 0. If it's 0, we'd go up to 3 and down to negative 3, and that's what cosine, so it's going to look something like this, right? So we want to know, what are we going to have to make this value here so that we're above the x-axis? So hopefully you could say, oh, look, the bottom would normally be at negative 3, so we have to move it up 3 just to get to 0. So we'd really have to say that d would have to be greater than 3, right? If it's equal to 3, it's not going to entirely work out, because part of it, like there would be a few spots where it would actually just hit right at, it would hit right on the x-axis. Okay, so d's got to be greater than 3 on that one. Okay, b entirely below the x-axis. So that means that this 3 is going to have to go down below there. So then that means that d would have to be less than negative 3, because you'd have to go down. You have to move this whole thing down negative 3, but you have to go a little bit farther so that it doesn't actually hit on the axis there. So d would have to be less than negative 3. Okay. What values of the graph does y equal 3 cosine x plus d lie partially above and partially below? So we know it works at 0, and we know that it will work. This is entirely above, this is entirely below. So partially above and partially below is anywhere in between those two, right? So from negative 3 to positive 3, our d would have to be greater than or equal to negative 3, and then less than or equal to positive 3, right? Okay, partially, well, if it's partially above, it actually just hits, so maybe we get rid of our equals to. So if d is less than 3, right, then it moves down to just, oh, actually it would move up here, so then it would just come down just below right here, and if it was just a little bit greater than negative 3, then that means this whole graph, let's see, negative 3, sorry, is going to be way down here, and the tops would start just up above it. Okay? All right, that's all we have for 9D Part 1 assignment. If you have any further questions on any of this or any anything else on the rest of the assignment, please feel free to ask. Thanks.